Jim Hunt actually made a legitimate living, had a real job for a long time, and discovered that actually it was more fun to create jobs for other people, and has been doing a wide variety of investing, specifically in cyber or in security related. So I'd love you to talk about that a little bit, and then I want to ask you a question about crowdsourcing.
So I guess April started out by talking about the fact that she was mature enough to know a lot of people in the room, and I always start these out by saying, I'm so old I actually have exits. So the majority of my focus since I spent time in the intelligence community in government years ago is looking at technologies that I think can have a positive impact on that mission. So if you're familiar with InQtel, I always say I was sort of InQtel before they started that group, and have now done a number of co-investments with them. So a lot of my focus is on information security, a little broader than cyber per se, but cyber certainly. Also done a fair amount throughout a long time with sensors, different types of information sensors, interesting data collection kinds of technology assist tools. And the majority of the things that I look at are products in that space. And so, you know, over, 25 years of doing this, I've done something like 65 investments and still have about 45 positions or something like that.
Do you see any particular piece of cyber? Obviously, sensors is a huge piece. What about the huge software issues? We've all watched the Target and Neiman Marcus disasters in the last few months. Is that going to get better, worse? Do you see solutions?
Well, I think it's a ever sort of perpetual issue of the guys that are writing the exploits. You know, cyber crime or internet crime anyway went by drugs a couple of years ago as the most lucrative illicit activity on the planet, and I don't think you're ever going to see a total ability to eradicate the problem. What you see, of course, are clever folks on both sides of the ball, if you will, coming up with defensive postures that work. There's some really clever, interesting new technologies out that I think will help that, but I'm not sure, at least in my lifetime, if I'll see it sort of come to an end. So that makes for some interesting investment opportunities, obviously, because each new exploit causes a counterbalance of somebody trying to fix it. The other thing that I have done some work in is really offensive cyber, but if you look at that issue today, there's a very limited number of customers who can legally buy them. And so they kind of sit here, or at least are generally headquartered here, and that's an interesting business, but it's awfully niche, whereas the defensive side is obviously much more pervasive.
Interesting. So Tom Scholl and I have known each other many years and worked together on a couple of companies. I said to him this morning, I wanted to ask him specifically about IPv6 because we had a company in common, and he said, yeah, it wasn't anywhere near the issue we all thought it was going to be. So I would like Tom to talk a little bit about that, the bubbles that he's seen. Tom has been both an investor, but as importantly, a creator of companies. He was talking to Bill Collins a few minutes ago about wishing he'd known the service guys when he was building products for the metro calls of the world, because that's where the money was. So where's the money now, Tom?
You know, I am really excited about what's going on right now. When I started my first company, Television Networks, we were in, I was telling Bill, we were making equipment. We were making cell phones. We were making some of our first digital cell phones, which was a hard thing to do in those days. And I remember talking to a person that I won't mention whose name it is, but it's somebody most people know in this room, who is a venture capitalist, and he said, what's Television's vision? And I said, basically in these wireless phones, there's going to be an FM receiver. You're going to be able to listen to your radio. You're going to be able to listen to music. You're going to be able to send emails. It's going to be basically a computer in your hand to be able to make phone calls with. And this guy looked at me and he said, you know, Tom, I don't believe that as far as I can throw. And everybody knows what's happened now. So to me, what's really interesting, and I'm going to get to the IPv6 thing in a second, people, every single thing you think about is going to have a brain. You know, and since I started out in software, you know, I love that because I think everything should have a computer in it. Why? I don't know. It should have a computer in it. And once it has a computer in it, you know, the next thing is it needs to talk and it needs to listen, it needs to communicate, and that's happening. And then after that happens, it's got to have sensors so it can see things. And then after that happens, it's got to move around. It's got to have transport. It's got to travel. And those things, just like mobile phones, it's going to be done. That's going to happen. I don't think probably anybody in this room denies that that's going to happen. It's just a logical next step. Now, can investors and entrepreneurs make money from that? It turns out that's a much more difficult proposition. And, you know, IPv6 is a good example of that because April asked me if that was happening. IPv6 is happening, but it's not happening with explosions. It's happening in a transitional way. And certainly the rest of the world is pushing it much more than the United States. So you're going to see this, these devices getting smarter. You're going to see them showing up in the consumer area first, just like wearables are showing up. But I think what's interesting is there's going to be a market beyond the consumer market. And when that starts happening and starts getting very industrial strength, you're going to see service provider companies around these kind of things, just like what happened with mobile. And you're going to see applications in the enterprise over a period of time. So it's very exciting. The biggest problem, as we mentioned, is, you know, what do you bet on and who do you bet on? But the backdrop is going to happen.
When Tom and I were talking earlier, we were laughing at, there's an old joke. I was in the real estate industry for a long time, and we used to talk about the best way to make a small fortune in Colorado real estate was to start out with a large one. And we have the same kind of set of issues in tech, I think, where we talk about these giant markets. Right now, one of the big issues is obviously the streaming music. You know, whether it's Spotify or Rhapsody or Patanga or whoever, you know, it's a giant market, but at the same time, we've got reports coming out saying no one will ever make any money at it. So the question is, you know, what are the business models that would work? Pascal, you and Core, you and I actually, I think the first deal we did together was in Phonic, which was back in the dark ages, where it was helping companies figure out their telco infrastructure, selling phones. We saw that, you know, go to the sky and then crater. What do you see, particularly in the telco or what are the areas that you think are the most interesting?
I was thinking about that yesterday, and it turns out what's old is actually now what's new. And so I remember when I started, my first job out of school at the University of Maryland was going to Bell Labs, and back then they gave you sort of the Bell Labs Bible of how everything was done. And if you opened it up, there was a cloud with two wires coming out of it, and there was always some little endpoint attached to that, and you know, so you had some job figuring out what that endpoint did and how it all worked. But it turns out, and you didn't have a computer, you had a terminal. All your data was stored somewhere else. And my office mate at the time and I decided, you know, it was really cool. We got a Macintosh. Now, Bell Labs was all Unix. It was all remote terminals. It was 2.4, 9.6 type of speeds, which today would be implausible. But we got ourselves two Macintosh computers, and we set up our own AppleTalk network, and we wanted to have sort of localized computing and all this other stuff. Well, you know, a couple of years later, if you now look at it, everything's moving to the cloud.
Absolutely.
Everything is mobile. There's nothing, that's tethered anymore. When you did your house a couple of years ago, everyone always pre-wired everything. I'm not sure anyone's used a local area network in their house ever in recent years. And so what you've seen is sort of a complete sort of rethinking of scale in the cloud, which was sort of what was done back then. And so those are sort of the areas that we've seen, that we've spent some time on. We did do, just on your streaming concept, it wasn't that obvious. We started out in voice over IP. And so we did some companies in voice over IP. We then went into streaming, and at the time we actually invested in a company that was bought by Cisco called Inlet Technologies. And what their claim to fame is trying to figure out what the different speeds and bit rates were to make the best picture on whatever phone or whatever computer or whatever else it was. And when Steve Jobs gave the first iPad talk, there were all the names of these big companies, cable companies, everything else, and we were actually quite proud of it. There was like something there that said Inlet Technologies, and everyone was like, what the hell is Inlet Technologies? Well, Apple was the first user of that technology, and finally Cisco decided they had to do it. But it's all those little steps that actually make it finally work when it gets down to your phone. And when you say today, I mean, at our house, yes, we have cable, but I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old, and my wife. I don't think we ever sit down and watch the same screen. Kids have mini iPads. They know how to get to Netflix and watch the shows they want to watch. My wife does something on her computer. I'm the last guy to watch ice dancing on the big TV screen. That's it.
That's because you have to watch the ads.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. So, Jim, I wanted to start with you. There's a piece in the last couple days from the Kauffman Institute that said that the number of companies that have been started, technology companies, has dropped fairly significantly. I would have thought with crowdsourcing and all of the interest in angel that it actually would have gone the other way. But it made me wonder, as a longtime angel investor, do you see crowdsourcing, crowdfunding being a major change in the atmosphere?
I do. And I think it may take, it may be like lots of technology trends, it may take longer than people thought. But if you look at AngelList syndicates today, they've had about 80,000 applications. They ostensibly have 30,000 accredited investors on the site. And I think they've done something like 1,800 raises. And that's in a very short period of time. Those of us that are in structured angel groups sort of scratch our head and say, can you really do the due diligence, or can you do the necessary prep work to sort of, protect yourself from things that can happen in a deal? And I think over time you'll see that strengthen in a big way. The other interesting thing to me, and a guy that was on my board previously, Brad Feld, who's obviously a luminary in the kind of the seed investing business, leads a number of those deals. So he'll put $50,000 against a deal that he's diligenced or his team has, and overnight he'll have $1 million syndicated on the deal, because we angels sometimes are like lemmings, and if we sense that Brad's done a good job on the prep work, we may look at that and follow him, as is obviously what's happening. So I think as it matures, and frankly as the SEC comes to grip with who, apart from accredited investors, can use these sites, you'll see a lot more opening of this. Whether that impacts the kind of deals that we see typically here in town, I'm not sure, because my view is a lot of the deals that I've seen on the AngelList syndicate site or others are more West Coast kind of interesting deals, and I'm not sure it'll impact us that much. I think it's also fair to say that we'll have some problem that will come up. We'll have some grandmother who will lose her, $10,000 of her last $20,000 in her savings because of some unscrupulous problem on the site. It's almost actuarially inevitable. But I do think you'll see it progress and mature over time.
Well, even if it's not unscrupulous. I mean, as an angel investor, I was in the women angels for a long time, and even if you have all these incredibly smart people doing the diligence, you don't get it right. I mean,
Correct.
it's the nature of
Right.
angels. I think it's fascinating. The other thing I find fascinating is so many of the deals that are getting funded are not tech. I mean, they're a dog washing service or something, which I think is fascinating. Tom, if you've been at any of these similar kinds of events in the last few months, everybody's talking about the Internet of Things or wearables. You're thinking about starting a company, starting some companies. You were ahead of the curve last time. Where's the curve going this time?
Yeah, well, that's a big problem for me, April, because typically I have been ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
And now I'm too old to be ahead of the curve. So I got to figure out how to be on the curve this time. And that's a lot more difficult to do. Like I said, I think, basically the thing you have to understand about me, what you do, and everybody up here does, but you may not, and that is, basically I'm a techno-weenie. I love technology. I think it can do a lot of things. So I have a lot of visions about, where things can go. So, the Internet of Things, to me, is something that's going to be done. I got my Fitbit band. I used it. I was disappointed in the software, frankly. The software, for me, was not easy enough to use. I thought about going over to the Nike Fuel Band and a couple of the other products that are out there, and I'm just kind of waiting for it to be easier, and I think it will get easier. If you're familiar with this website called Quantified Self, it's going to be you're going to be able to find out all kinds of things about yourself by putting all kinds of devices on your body. And I go to the gym every day. I see more and more people come with some new whiz-bang thing, and everybody's all over it. It's like, oh, wow, you got this new thing. How's it working? You can find out this thing about yourself. And then after you find this thing out about yourself, like one of the things I wanted to find out was, how am I really sleeping at night? And the answer was, well, I'm not sleeping at night very well. And I already knew that, So thanks a lot for telling me that I was this many minutes up. But I already knew that, and I didn't find it that fascinating. Maybe it's fascinating over 10 years. I don't know. Another thing I'd like to mention, some things I think are going to be happening is most people have heard about a company called Bloom Energy, which does fuel cells. I think distributed power is going to be happening.
Really?
I think that company has got the opportunity to potentially go public this year. They haven't said that, but I think it's possible. I think that'll change the landscape from just solar and wind to something else. Another area I'm excited about is digital imaging. Digital imaging is, it's already changed in the cell phone, obviously, but at the big picture, it's possible with sensors, to do things in digital imaging that never been done before. What that also means is taking those images and putting them on the internet and viewing them on the internet, not just on your camera or device.
Interesting. So, Pascal, you alluded to the cloud as being sort of the next thing. What do you see? Will we reach a place where we get comfortable with everything being distributed and the security thereof? Or I have a client that's talking about sort of the ultimate personal cloud, which is that you sort of have it, in your stick, walk around with it or something, so that you pull everything out of the atmosphere and block it. What are your thoughts? Are you seeing anything particularly exciting in that area?
I look at all of that stuff as it's just where you're going. I mean, we have companies that have done software protection, for example, that protect large CAD/CAM producers that are mostly localized still and not in the cloud. But you can just see that business, sort of hampered by the entire movement into the cloud. You look at Adobe, everything's in the cloud. My wife's a photographer. It annoys her to no end that she now has to pay $18 a month to deal with Adobe. And they don't really guarantee, I mean, her biggest concern is, I don't know, take your pick. We got a couple of terabytes of data. What do you do with that? And if it just disappears on you, what happens?
Yeah.
And turns out when your hard drive freezes up, it disappeared on you in any case. So you've got to think through those models a little bit. But I think the issue on cloud is that's where it's going. And security, if you really think through that, matters. We just invested in a company in a couple of days ago on the second round. And this is a group of guys coming out of AWS. And what they have decided is that they're trying to figure out how to manage cloud servers in a way that is much more secure. Because cloud servers get instantiated, they stand up there forever. People don't really know whether those things have been attacked or not until somebody goes in or whatever. And what they've decided is, let's just play the cloud servers like a movie reel. Every hour we change a cloud server so that there's no way to attack it in something like this. Whether they'll be successful or not, I don't really know. But what I do know is everybody that's in the cloud and worrying about how to figure out to secure it has gravitated towards some of these folks. I mean, I've never seen anybody create a certain amount of excitement like this that we've seen. And then last year we sold a company called Jackbee. We sold that to Software AG. And the big aha moment for Software AG was they had invested in Terracotta, which is a very fast sort of database. But what they realized is they couldn't connect it to anything. And there were a lot of data sources in different places that didn't really connect to each other. And so Jackbee had actually developed over a lot of years different connectors to data sources that suddenly Software AG realized they needed that. Because what had changed suddenly was a lot of open source visualization, making things really possible that you couldn't do a few years ago. And big pieces of data technology that came from the bottom, but it turned out that when you talk about big data, it's not about what you got, but about what you don't have. Right. And it's that next piece of data that may actually give you some insight into something that you didn't know before, and that's what the Jackbee acquisition by Software AG was about last year. And so I just think that people start thinking about obviously how to monetize this has become a big issue, whether you pay by the drink or pay by the drip. And on the consumer side, you're starting to see it. I mean, when you look at everything you pay for a month, $18 to Sirius, $180 to the cable guys, $100 to the cell phone guys, someone sooner or later, I mean, the share of wallet, that business model issue is going to become increasingly problematic because I don't want to pay somebody else now 18 months to do my photography here. I mean, it just, what you've really done is you've taken a $180 product and now made it perpetually $18 a month.
Absolutely.
And so trying to figure out those business models, while today they can still sort of ramp up, I think sooner or later we're going to start hitting a point where people start looking exactly what they use and say, you know what, I really don't need that second line at the house.
Oh.
And nobody...
Don't need that first line anymore.
You don't, well, that's my point. But you pay for it.
Yep.
And you feel like you shouldn't get rid of it or whatever else. And so the business models of these cloud things are going to become increasingly more difficult to try to figure out because, freemium, non-freemium, how to add a little bit of here or there. And so that thing, I think, will start becoming increasingly more difficult on that side of the equation.
Interesting. So I didn't say anything. Tian invited me to. So Hercules is a publicly traded, what's known in the trade as a business development corporation. Essentially, we lend money, we call it growth capital, to venture-backed companies, typically between 10 and 100 million in revenue, who are not yet profitable, but are looking to use a little debt instead of additional equity. So in my practice, which is where I'm going with this, I'm actually doing a lot in healthcare. And none of you mentioned healthcare. No, I didn't lead you to that. But what do you think? Is that going to be something, and I don't mean bio, we actually separated Hercules. We have 3 practice areas, which is ironic, which used to be technology, not clean tech, which is now actually energy and all that cool stuff that people do, which is a specialty. On the other side, we have a bio, we call it life sciences, which is pharma and equipment, basically. And in the middle is kind of everything else, and I'm in the everything else, so part of it is healthcare, which is a lot of equipment, software stuff. Any of you doing anything in that? Want to do anything in it? Think I'm crazy?
I think it's huge. You know, there are big opportunities in healthcare. My latest opportunity is my nephew is coming to see me tomorrow to talk about his latest startup in healthcare or IT, and that's because he's going to Johns Hopkins as a doctor, and
Yes.
he sees an opportunity. And he happened to win a business planning contest. So, I mean, that's the kind of
Yeah.
stuff that's going on. Healthcare is very robust in terms of lots of opportunities. Again, in that area, in the IT area, the problems are, some of them are fairly easy to define. Patient security, but how you solve it and who's the winner is, again, difficult. One of my favorite areas is medical devices.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, I hope everybody in this room understands that the United States FDA has practically destroyed the medical device market in the United States.
Yep.
Destroyed.
That and the tax.
Well, not just with tax, with the
That and the tax.
how you get the
Yeah.
market.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And so people are going overseas in order to get the market, with medical devices. And I have a lot of friends doing medical devices, and they can't get the market in the United States. I'll just give one other, example of a medical device product that I bet most people in this room would love to have. You may remember this company, Aspect Medical, who built a product to determine whether or not somebody was under anesthesia before they had an operation, because sometimes they weren't. There's sort of an analog to that, and that is pain.
Mm.
What kind of pain do you have? There's some statistic that in the United States, something like over 40% of people over 50 have 24/7 pain. And so I'm sure you have parents or somebody who has pain, and they have constant pain. You go to the doctor and you say, what are the alternatives for my pain? And unfortunately, they're not very nice alternatives. And unfortunately, they can't kind of plug you in, run this test, and say, oh, on the painometer, you're like 6, and since you're a 6, this is what we need to do for you. Or you've got this kind of pain versus that kind of pain. So I think there's going to be a vast opportunity for medical diagnoses of pain and pain management in the future.
So I have to tell you, some of you know, I just had my knee replaced actually 2 weeks ago today, and they come into your hospital room, and what they've done now is decided to ask you how your pain is. And I don't know if any of you've had this. So it's 6 faces, and it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 actually, 10 faces. Where are you on the pain scale? And I want to look at this nurse and say, you idiot, it is totally related to how recently you gave me the narcotics. I mean, if I take my Percocet, I'm down here on the 1. If I haven't, I'm up here on the 10. It's just so imprecise. It's like, Anyway, that's another day's story.
Yeah,
Jim.
well, another thing to do, April, by the way, is make sure you have a board meeting after you've taken a couple of Percocets. It's a whole different.
Yeah, my husband said,
better.
are you sure you want to be up on a panel this morning? You might say something rude, but so far I haven't done anything. Jim, any comments on health?
Well, I'm going to need it. I'm going to need health care.
We all do.
On the pain subject, I always find that interesting when they ask on a 1 to 10, and I always say, compared to, as a young guy, a gunshot wound that I had, it's a 2.
Yeah, right.
So, it's,
Right.
you never know. But I'm not a healthcare investor, although in our group we have a couple of executives who've cashed out of that space, and they take the lead on those deals for us, and we've found some very interesting opportunities in healthcare investing. What I think is interesting, if you think about what at least the forecasters say about maybe the 3 most interesting areas to invest from a vertical perspective, it's healthcare, education, and maybe government. And why is that? It's because they've been so slow at technology adoption that all of it comes down to an underlying issue of, can you radically increase the efficiency of these particular verticals through technology? So almost everything we've looked at is some kind of technology that relates to that, and it really goes to Tom's point.
Yeah. Pascal?
I think one of the problems, though, for me looking at healthcare has always been the channels. I mean, how many business plans have you seen with some guy coming to you, wants to sell into the doctor's office? And then you're sitting at the doctor's office and you see somebody with a suitcase there and they're talking to their, I mean, it's just really, really hard. Even though some of these markets exist, the doctor's offices, they already have somebody in there that's sold them the computer system, is managing their IT for them. They're, you know, you look, they've still got a rack of files that you know, is so daunting for them to change the chart that it's hard to see. And their things move slowly, but that sales cycle looks like, I mean, they kind of make carriers look like really fast adopters. And, you know, it's like, really? You try to sell to Hopkins or somebody like that. And so I think that's part of the other side of the equation, which is you have to understand how hard it is to try to sell into that. And are there anything that's changing? I think the one thing that has changed in healthcare is the iPad. That itself may change the entire dynamic and parameter, because beforehand you didn't have something as game-changing as that device, which was almost invented for doctors.
Right. Actually, good point.
And that itself may pull through a bunch of things. The question is, what are they, and where do you start on that? And that's something that's been very hard for us to think through, because you know, you would think you just see it. Something's got to happen, but the mobile aspect of convenience in a hospital will now obsolete those systems faster than before. Now the trick is trying to find which ones actually you can get at.
You know, you're right. Just one other little story. The one person that used to pop into my hospital room was the guy who came to scan the equipment. Now, why does there need to be a person scanning the equipment? With the existence of the kind of powered cells, they ought to be able to. In fact, there's a company here, Ekahau, who does something like that. But it's one more example of how hard it is to you know, you got all these pieces. So let me see, let me make a shift. Before I do that, if any of you have a health IT solution, I'm involved with a group at Health TechNet that's going to do an investor day with the hospitals and providers later in March, and I'd be happy to chat with you about it if anybody's interested in that. But having said that, questions? Anybody got a question for the panel? Yes. I think they're going to bring you a microphone. Why don't you tell us who you are and ask your question?
My name is Lex McCusker. No one has mentioned changes in the GPS system. I've heard it's going to get much more precise in the near future, and I'd like to hear some thoughts about what that means for technology, investment, and other capabilities.
How long do we go? Okay.
To be fair, it's something that I got here pretty well with my iPhone today, so plus minus 10 yards has been okay for us. We haven't seen that many sort of specific investments tied to changes in GPS. There are, however, a lot of changes sort of in people trying to figure out where you are at any given time that's relevant to them. So there's a lot of beacons that either tell you that you're close to a particular place, and now they're trying to, you know, sell you something. I mean, if you go to Walgreens or whatever, it's the most annoying thing. I drive up Connecticut Avenue, and this Walgreens app always shows up. So clearly there's some amount of geo-fencing and sort of on the commercial, on the retail side, that they're trying to figure some things out. And we've seen business plans that try to either map Wi-Fi and things like that, as opposed to, I can't really think of one specific business plan I've seen today that deals with GPS, the specific question you asked, which is, you know, is GPS getting more precise? I'm sure there are, but
we've seen a couple of companies that are working in the area of in-building, not so much broad scale. You know, I remember driving to Boston or Baltimore for a meeting and being dropped at an intersection, having no idea where I was supposed to be.
Well, that plus where you are in a building,
right.
Whether you're on the first floor or the
Third
30th floor.
That's being
matters,
driven
and
largely
things
by
like
the EMS.
That's correct.
But that's going to be a fairly big space.
I think the next generation, in theory, will have better building penetration, which goes to that point. And maybe that will make the predator shots a little more accurate. So
drones right here in your neighborhood. Anybody?
Can I change seats with you a little further?
No, thank you. Questions? Yes. He's coming right there.
Dennis Lucy, TKC Global. History is a great teacher. Some of us are old here and remember the mainframe days and remember time sharing, and that often is very close to cloud computing. From a Jesuitical point of view, is there a difference between time sharing and cloud computing?
Well, I can take on a piece of that.
Because you're the Jesuit in the room?
I think one of the big things that's different today, in the olden days, you didn't have as much choice about where the computing was going to get done. It cost too much to put it on your desk. So you had these big computer centers that you went to that were cold, and because they had big mainframes in there, and they had raised floors, if you'll remember. And there were businesses that did that, and you had mag tapes. And that's because that costs a lot of money. What you have now is you have more of an opportunity as a technologist and as a person that's bringing a system to market to think about how much intelligence is there going to be at the end device and how much is going to be in the cloud, and be able to make that trade-off, have more flexibility in how you make that trade-off than in the olden days. So I think that's one of the biggest issues. I think the second biggest issue, although there were a lot of things that happened in the old days that people didn't talk about, it was the privacy issue. Both with all the devices and with the cloud, everybody who uses that stuff is just going to leave tracks all over the place, and even trying to figure out what tracks you're leaving behind is tough, and you can try to avoid it, and it's if you use any application, it's tough to avoid leaving your name all over the place. That's why I was telling Pascal my name on Facebook is Sue Chief, and that helps a little bit. One son figured out that was his dad, and the other one didn't respond to me, when I tried to be friends.
But I think the subtle difference in time sharing and cloud is time sharing had a connotation of a finite resource. The whole issue with cloud computing is much more elastic in the sense that while it's not necessarily infinite in the true sense, it is much more scalable and much more infinite. So that time sharing was, it was cheaper to do it at midnight to 3 if you wanted to do heavy computing than something else. And cloud is just a different thought process behind that. That's different than just it's remote. The difference here is infinite scaling and sort of when you need computing, you can augment it with more power in the cloud or more storage as you need it, and then you can scale it down. So you're not paying for the guy in the cloud is in some way time sharing, but as a user, it is much more elastic and much more flexible than it used to be, which was just based on, as you said, time. The way that it's pieced out now, I think, is very, very different and actually much more exciting to businesses that really need to use all of this stuff. And part of that is just storage is so much cheaper and processing and all this other stuff, so that scale and how you manage that scale remotely is much more easy to now access than it used to be.
Good, thank you.
I've got a question back here.
Yep.
So Gloria Jakobowicz, I'm wondering if you guys could give some suggestions. What is the next disruptive technology? What do you envision as the next disruptive technology?
Electric car's been taken.
The electric. So I
will-
actually have a thought. I have a client, and sorry, I'll let you think for a minute. I have a client that's is in the chip business, and they have a chip that allows a very high level of audio response. So like many women, I spend probably 10 minutes a day looking for my cell phone in my briefcase to turn it on. And this is an active, very low power chip that's active. So you speak to it. I don't have to find it. I don't have to swipe it. And their vision is all of this Internet of Things that you talk to. Now, I'm not sure I really want to talk to my toaster, but it would be very nice to be able to talk to my phone or some of the things that disappear in my life. So I really do think this wearable thing, now, all three of the panelists have said, the problem is finding a model for it. They're all basically commercial applications. Do you put it in your dishwasher? Do you put it in your cell phone? This particular company uses it in sound bars, so you can move the sound up with your hand. You don't have to get up off the sofa and go move it. Given how fat we are, that's probably not a good thing. But it's, there are these kinds of things that I think are very cool. I don't know if that's disruptive or just a modification, but Pascal?
I'm a firm believer you don't know it's disruptive till it's
Exactly.
You can always see things in the rearview mirror besides being sort of in front of it. But the concept of connectivity expanding and like you said, wearable things, I mean, I'm fascinated. If you look at what Google is trying to do when you see glass and some of these things, but one of these things is these guys have a plan to launch 60,000 weather balloons to now cover more than the next billion people for internet usage. But in that process, what you end up also having is the largest constellation of weather balloons in the world. That you've never had this much data. I mean, NOAA and OSHA and all these people, OSHA, NOAA, they send up a certain amount of data. And so what you get from systems that suddenly become so large that help you understand even more than you could before may actually be more disruptive than we think if that project finally gets off the ground.
I think that's great. Tom?
There's just all kinds of things I can think of, but the latest one that's on my mind is the robots working together.
Yes.
You may have seen. There's been a lot of stuff on YouTube about helicopters flying together in all kinds of ways. If you go to Quad Rotor, you can see those. The latest thing is termite robots that are building termite villages independently.
Why would you want one?
Well, it's just
Put
to,
back what the others killed.
Oh,
basically it's distributed intelligence.
okay.
But that's part of what being disruptive is all about. You don't know why you would want it, but it's you're going to want it someday. And if you're not going to want it, your kids are going to want it.
They probably already have one, turns out. Jim?
Well, I guess I'd agree with everything, and I think a lot of it does come down to the Internet of Things and how interconnected we're likely to be. I've had these dreams of the little helicopter delivering my book from Amazon and my dog, of course, killing, the helicopter. I'm still struggling with that one, but I really think that is going to be the most interesting part. The other issue, of course, which is a really prevalent theme in the investment community, is what do we do with all this data? And it's going to be a compounding problem of trying to figure out, it's very clear to me that Google did not buy Nest because they wanted to worry about electric, or energy efficiency in the house.
Right.
And to the point on the GPS question, the same thing is the data is getting to be so overwhelming that you almost can be guaranteed of anything that's really relevant you're probably not ever going to be able to find. So I think that's going to be a really interesting area.
I think that's fascinating. I heard Harry Weller say something a few weeks ago about that it turns out to be a lot harder to monetize all this data than anybody thought. And I suspect that's the Clarabridge MicroStrategies challenge, which is you can go scrape it, and then how the hell do you know what it's, whether it means anything or not, and is it actionable in any?
By the way, April, you asked about why does somebody want the robotic termites? In talking to Bill about the mobile phone networks, it always blew my mind at the time that there were a whole bunch of people that weren't really sure whether people would want cell phones. There was a lot of industry analysis done on how many people will want a cell phone. Now you have to realize That's when a cell phone was a bag phone or a phone where you went to a special person to get it installed in your car.
Yes.
And so then it
Absolutely.
was like, so if you got a $2,000 phone installed in your car, you were somebody.
Right.
But then it's like, how many people are going to pay $2,000 to get a phone installed in their car? So back in those days, it was like, well, we're not really sure whether people are going to want cell phones.
You know, you could store 10 numbers in the first Motorola brick that came out.
And that's way too many.
I was recruited to Northern Virginia in 1982 to run the Fairfax County Economic Development Authority. Bill knows. And I remember my chairman was the chairman of DynCorp. He was a very forward-looking kind of guy. He's now gone. But we were sitting having a board meeting one day, and he brings in this phone. And it's the size of a fire extinguisher. You know, it sits on the table. And it's very impressive. And the phone rings, and it's a wrong number. And I thought, we are all looking at the future here. Having said that, I did my first deal in Brazil this year. There are more mobile phones in Brazil than there are people. So one of the things I find really interesting in our business is how much is about taking what we already have or know how to do and selling it to a whole lot more people, or watching it be morphed in. I remember the first cell phone sitting in Ireland in 1985, and the guy in the garbage truck had a cell phone. And I thought this, at the point where we still were doing landlines. So change globally is going to be very interesting. Would you like us to, one more question? Anybody else? Okay.
So I'm Landon with Profile Health Systems.
Hello, Landon.
So I've got a question about risk. With opportunity, there's always risk. You mentioned that the most exciting verticals were healthcare, education, and government technology adoption in those fields. There's been a lot of talk about cloud computing. And I think we all know that net neutrality is kind of constantly under fire. So I'm curious about how you perceive that risk affecting these markets, if you think it's a risk.
Interesting question. Good question. Great one to finish with. All right, Jim.
That's a great question, but to be honest with you, I don't know that I've thought about it that much. And the reason probably is that I believe it'll be kind of a ubiquitous way it affects everything. So does that change the profile of an investment? It could, and certainly would for maybe things like very ubiquitous search or other areas where they're going to stratify the value on the pipe of whatever it may be. But I don't know that it has really come into play in a lot of my portfolio. So I think it's a very interesting question, and one I probably don't lose a lot of sleep over.
Tom, you come from a long telecom.
Well, I think Jim really hit the nail on the head. It's always who's the king, the content guys or the bandwidth guys, and kind of goes back and forth. And it's, as Jim said, it's definitely a big issue, but it's not just going to affect one little niche. Any change like that's going to have a huge impact. And
So Pascal has a specific view of this, since his partner just went to go be the chairman of the FCC. So what's Tom think?
I do have a good view of this, which is to stay away from that question.
To avoid it.
But to be fair, I think there is a constant balance between the guys that own the pipes and that want somebody to pay for putting them out there, and the guys that need the information to go over there. That's a cost of doing business, and there's a constant struggle with all of that. And I'm glad I'm not having to make that decision that joins it. But it does. I think these issues. There are sort of long-term risks. I mean, the last thing you want to do is invest in Netflix and then find out that they're going to have to pay 25% of every dollar that they make, and then your whole investment thesis sort of went out of the window. But I don't think it affects us in the current places. If you're thinking about sort of enterprise software or things like that, I think in the short term that's not something that rises up and goes, oh, whatever Tom decides on net neutrality is going to affect us one way or the other.
I'd leave you with one last comment. There was a very good piece in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, apropos of what the panelists have said, about how the speed of change increased in so much. We had a question about the GPS. This writer's comment was, the day that Google Maps was released, the TomTom stock dropped 80%. 80%. The ability to be truly disintermediated happens at a speed that I think most of us haven't seen. So I think whatever you're thinking about, be aware that there's a possibility of it being the ground underneath you changing. Thank you.
Just
Sorry.
one comment
Yes,
on
please.
that. There's even in security, I mean, there's a constant question of what if Apple just makes this a feature?
Yes.
I mean, there are all sorts of businesses that have got started that overnight disappear if Apple decides to do X.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, panel.
Thanks, April.